Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Green College. Welcome back to Green College, where, as always, we savor the privilege of living, working, and sharing ideas on the traditional, ancestral, unseen land of the Muslim people. We're also grateful again this evening for the largesse of Cecil and Ida Green for creating the Green Visiting Professorships program with no strings attached, except that we can never appoint a professor of theology. And I think that string is only there because UBC cannot appoint professors of theology. The business of theological training being left to the affiliated theological colleges, of which, of course, Green College is not one. Although occasionally we have been asked, who then was St. Green? Thanks to our patron saints, Cecil and Ida. And special thanks too to the member of Common Room at Green College, who is the faculty host at UBC for our Cecil and Ida Green Visiting Professor of the Hour, Gaulle, who will introduce her in a moment. Dr. Gao, as I've learned to call him, since I heard him called that by one of the students, is a freak, and I'll let him explain that when you have a chance to get him into conversation. But he really is a remarkable contributor to Green College as well. He is a sometime leading scholar of the college and has been extremely dynamic and good instance of how that kind of leadership we imagine might indeed be exercised. The Green Visiting Professorships these days come about because members of the greater Green College community, resident members, members of Common Room, leading scholars, past or present, others who've had some working relationship with the college, say to one another, and then one other room says to me, you know, it would be good if we had a visit from so-and-so. If you're wondering, and if you have ideas, that's the process. It is extremely rigorous, and we do in fact only have really interesting and powerful presenters. And I don't think there's anyone in this room here who's going to dare to contradict that generalization. I can't think of a dud in the last 10 years, and other people's memories go back further. So somehow this works, and it's a great delight for us to have our present visitor, of whom more in just a moment. We do not, as you know, have any kind of substantive program at Green College. There is no assigned theme or mandate beyond providing a medium and a venue in which people can talk and think aloud, face to face. And yet, somehow, from time to time, elements of a zeitgeist do somehow appear on the screen of Green College. In a couple of weeks' time, you'll be able to come and hear Anna Porter talking about George Soros. In the middle of November, you'll be able to hear UBC political scientist Michael Byers talking about Elon Musk. It could appear that this evening's talk is inaugurating a certain kind of unplanned series on a theme all too visibly emergent in our times. I leave that to you and others to work through in due course. Meanwhile, Guggenheim, thank you very much for bringing Ruth here. Over to you. Yeah.
I'd like to start by thanking Mark for giving us assistant professors at UBC the opportunity to bring external speakers to contribute to the academic atmosphere at UBC. And I'm very happy and honored to introduce the speaker of tonight's talk. Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, where she chaired the department for many years and helped to make it into one of the premier Italian departments in North America. And Ruth is recipient of a Guggenheim and a Fulbright, among many other prestigious fellowships, for books and articles on topics ranging from fascism and authoritarianism to propaganda and colonialism. I'd like to mention 4 of Ruth's books as a sort of setup for her talk today. Her very first book, is titled Fascist Modernities, and it's considered one of the major contributions to cultural analysis of fascism. And history in general. And I'd like to mention very quickly that Lucy is also doing another talk titled Visualizing Fascism tomorrow in Buchanan Tower at 3:15. And for detail, you can check out Green College's website where it is advertised. And Ruth also co-edited two books which have contributed immensely to the intellectual enterprise of Italian studies as an academic field in North America. The first volume is about Italian colonialism, which until perhaps 15 years ago was a somewhat obscure subject for both Italians and non-Italians because of the amnesia and Italy's fascist problem in a way, right? And the other co-edited volume that Ruth did recently was about Italian mobilities. So this idea of putting forward the paradigm of mobilities in conceiving Italian cultural history relating diaspora to immigration and refugees. But I'd like to focus on her latest, her new book. Her new book project is on a topic that she has been writing extensively for the media, including CNN and many other media outlets. And it will be published by Norton, and it is titled Strongman, How They Rise, Why They Succeed, How They Fall. And tonight, I think we're going to have a little glimpse into the latest research results that Dr. Ben-Ghiat is bringing forward. So we're very happy to have her here, and I'll just have her get to it.
Thank you. I have a mic. Is it, I'm not sure it's working or not. You can hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much to Mark and to Dr. Gaulle, who is doing himself extremely original and innovative work on the Italian-Chinese relationship and Chinese in Italy. So I'm very happy to be here as the Cecil and Ida Green visiting professor and to present what is research in progress. I just did a segment on CBC radio, and they said that my book on Strongman is forthcoming, but it's actually still being written. So it's all the more reason to have your feedback and comments and what is most interesting to you from this. So this is the age of strongmen. Such rulers are governing in close to 50 nations, depending on how you define such a category, and certainly some of the most geopolitically important places, China and Russia and Turkey. And even in many democracies, free elections, the rule of law, the liberty to assemble, and freedom of the press are increasingly threatened as authoritarian-minded rulers try and colonize state institutions with loyalists. They criminalize protest. They organize propaganda circuits to spread their own visions of reality and try and discredit everybody else's. We're also seeing in the last years the spread of an ethos of intolerance measured in spikes of hate crimes against immigrants, Muslims, people of color, and women, and gays and other such categories, basically the non-straight white male and ethnic minorities, religious minorities. These variously are blamed for the nation's ills and accused of trying to undermine its traditions, or even in Europe and America, the entirety of white Christian civilization. So with the election of Donald Trump in November 2016, America has joined this global trend. The White House now hosts a man who openly admires authoritarian rulers and their practices and seeks to align our country with the forces working against liberal democracy and the transatlantic alliance, of which Canada has been so important in both those things. So when you're a historian of fascism and authoritarian regimes, it's never a good sign when your expertise is relevant and you're in demand by the media. And I've watched with dismay as some of the most disturbing psychological and political dynamics of past years have resurfaced. alliance systems of soft and hard power are being constructed among the right. Alliances of propaganda, of paramilitary training, and more around the project of derailing European democracy and American democracy. And this reminds me, in this kind of frenetic activity, of the project of the Axis in the late 1930s. Only now the agents of this activity include elected American officials who seek to turn the U.S. into an ally of this latest new order. And I would love to see an infograph, I haven't seen one yet, of the lines of funding and activity among America and the various Western Europe and Russian nations doing this with this project. It makes perfect sense that two former communists with extensive experience in autocracy, Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban, are mentors and patrons of younger politicians like Italian Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini and Austrian Chancellor Christian Kurz, who's only 31 years old. So it's been very, very disturbing for me to look at America from the point of view of a scholar of authoritarian foreign regimes and find elected Republican officials taking positions more in line with regimes than with democracies. So here we have Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, Texas being a huge and very important state, joking about shooting journalists. And here we have, I don't know if you can see this, we have Representative Steve King of Iowa, who has made himself into a very busy man. He's the liaison between, one of the many, the U.S. and the European right. And so he's a fan of the Dutch writer Geert Wilders. And here he says, Wilders understands that culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies, somebody else being immigrants and people of color. And these are elected, top officials in our country. So clearly the Pandora's box that Trump has opened in America will not be easily closed. So, we tend to focus on Trump, but the problem is much bigger. And it will not go away even if Trump is eventually removed by election or investigation. And I'm sad to say that I don't think that either of those is a very good possibility. He may win easily in 2020. So some who watch from outside of America, I know now we're all depressed. That seems to be my specialty. I think the Washington Post called me among the gloomiest. So anyway, some who watch outside of America may feel this is divine justice, a nation that secretly helped tyrants come to power in Chile and many other countries must now suffer a potential tyrant of its own. Yet defenders of democracy everywhere will pay a price when the leader of the free world changes teams, not least because their own rulers and other rogue actors will no longer be contained by fear of American censure, right? If we had the card of sanctions and other kinds of ways to stop people from violating human rights, and now if our leader advocates the opposite of human rights, we have no card to play. So here's a cartoon. It was the cover of the 2018 Freedom in the World report. It's an annual report issued by Freedom House, which tracks these things. And it really captures well this situation. So we have a female warrior representing democracy and human rights, besieged by arrows. And of course, the strongmen are the people we don't see launching the arrows. And you have knights or representing, the major democracies cowering behind her. But America is not among them. Donald Trump has thrown his shield on the ground. He sits in the rear facing away from the Democrats, tweeting. So he's there in the bottom. He's at the bottom right. The far right. Thank you. The far right. The far right. Trump is, however, simply the American expression of a larger shift in ideals of political leadership. And we don't pay enough attention to this. We're studying systems, rightfully so, but there's been a real shift in ideals and models of political leadership that privileges the strongman. Force over consensus and diplomacy, and sees humanitarianism as a sign of weakness. So here we have Putin. This is one of the pictures from his annual calendar. It's a Putin for every month. And Google it, or you'll see they have them every year. They are printed by a popular, they're kind of sponsored by a popular publication, but nothing comes out with Putin on it, and 12 Putins to boot without his approval. And here is, he has made himself, in the communist tradition, Lenin was a commercial object too. He has made himself a designer object. So this is his cologne. Well, it says inspired by Vladimir Putin, called Leaders Number One. Now, in theory, it should be Leader Number One, so I don't know what that is about. But so here we have Putin. So, but for every Justin Trudeau standing, we have a Putin or an up-and-coming demagogue like Salvini, who also likes to have himself depicted with, he doesn't wear a chain usually, sometimes he does, but he likes to show his pecs off, who enjoys wide popularity, although or because he calls for mass cleansings of immigrants in Italy, and he'd rather collaborate with foreign autocrats than the center left of his own country. And there are other people who fit that description too. The flag of the European Union with its egalitarian circle of stars could not be more at odds with the mentality of the strongman, the strongman thinks in hierarchical terms. Of course, he's on top, and only collaborates if it benefits his image, his power, or his bank account. So to have influence and longevity in this new political climate, even some politicians who oppose strongman politics, indeed are great defenders of democracy, have cultivated an image of forcefulness. French President Emmanuel Macron has adopted a decisive, and some say imperial or de Gaulle-like manner. His signature firm handshake, which became like a vice when he met with Trump at the G7 meeting, is designed to leave a physical as well as psychological impression. So the inset shows, it's the top hand, that he gripped Trump's hand so hard that it left a white impression. So you see, I don't know if you can see that, but some beady-eyed journalist, photojournalist, caught that. And it's very interesting because Macron has done this all along, and in fact a recent article said, who does Trump call among foreign leaders for advice? And the number one person he's calling, although he says he loves the North Korean leader, or in love with him, is Macron. So this kind of like forcefulness works with these guys. So many studies on the present situation focus on political systems, and we think of books that really do a great job of this. How Democracies Die is a recent one, or many of the books on populism. So I decided to focus my book on the leader. For 100 years, he's been the anchor of the regimes that rise up from the ashes of democracy. Around him swirl enablers who live for his approval and enemies who plot to kill him. He has his ever-changing cabinet. A lot of their cabinets are like, a revolving door because they're very difficult people to work for. And his inner circle, which is often heavy with members of his own family. He has business elites who he needs for legitimacy and to make his deals, and the few women who have his ear, usually daughters, wives, or important mistresses, because then there's many mistresses, but only some are important mistresses. So while my book draws on decades of research on fascism and other types of regimes, it was prompted by the arrival of Trump on the political scene. Indeed, I put aside a more academic book to do this book and to devote a lot of time to writing for the media. And I started writing about Trump for CNN in 2015 after I saw a video of him at a rally. And he was doing the loyalty oath, he was doing the slogans, the lock her up, and fake news and journalists. And I realized it was I remember where I was at this moment in Washington Square Park, that what he was doing was deeply familiar to me. So I actually rushed home and I, did an op-ed for CNN on that and on his method of retweeting visual things from the right. So some believe that historians should not be pundits, which was the title of an op-ed that appeared in the New York Times. Some say it's inappropriate to draw parallels to the past or point to precedents as a means of understanding the present. But I felt like for me, this was what I needed to do. So I've now written over 60 pieces for CNN, The Atlantic, Washington Post, etc., arguing that the majority on propaganda on various topics, but many of them talk about how Trump's actions, his attitudes, and his personal quirks even become legible when they're viewed in the context of a century of authoritarian rule. So that's what this book is doing. It goes from Mussolini to Trump, via Pinochet, via Berlusconi, who's a very interesting hinge, we'll get to that, and up to Trump and Putin and Erdogan. So I'm going to preview here, just very briefly, some of my findings on questions like, what makes strongmen stand out from other repressive rulers? Why do they appear and appeal at certain times in history? Why do people support them no matter what they say or do? What are their weaknesses? How are they most effectively resisted? And how do we get them out of power, which is what most people are most interested in. So whether in the 1920s or today, strongmen find favor at times of uncertainty and perceived transition when politics as usual no longer works for many people. And the whole thing about economic anxiety, economic downturns can hugely help, as in the case of Hitler, but they're not even necessary and they're not enough. We have racism, we have the sense that things are shifting, that people feel unprotected. They're natural disruptors, and strongmen are often full of disdain for established parties and institutions. They introduce new movements and issues into the political landscape. They communicate in original ways, including in the language of violence. They're very, very skilled at introducing verbal violence and leaving others to take their hints. They have another talent, strongmen. They can be many things to many people. This accounts for their motley crew of followers. You have respectable businessmen and clergy, together with ruthless military commanders and street thugs. And this recurs in every one of them, from Mussolini to Trump. They create these new constituencies of people who previously didn't really go together. And I highlight the importance of enablers and allies who are motivated by opportunism, ideology, and eventually fear. In America, the Republican Party is filling the role in a textbook manner because once these elites make their deals at the beginning with the leader, they decide they're going to support him. And once they sign on publicly, they are in the game till the bitter end. No matter what that man says or does, they support him. So we have the Republican Party sticking with Trump through allegations of sexual assault, support for pedophiles, conflicts of interest, and the Russia scandal. And they have taken it all. And so this is the latest example of something we find many times in history. Another element to the strongman's success is storytelling. He has a very special ability as a narrator and a performer, and this sets him apart from other kinds of rulers. He knows how to foster feelings of belonging among audiences, especially the sentiment he values most, which is loyalty. The contents of Hitler's orations moved millions, but so did their emotional intensity. They know how to use words, gestures, and images to elicit a sense of togetherness that sustains them throughout their time in office. They early on have, get these emotional bonds with their followers who stick with them. No matter what. They also have narratives. One of them is about the expanded nation, the nation that's going to become great again, right? Make America great again. That's a very common thing. But they're very smart in the way they do this. One of the things is that they mobilize, they have a vision of the expanded nation, some of them. This could be imperialism, or it could be mobilizing immigrants to become ambassadors for the nation and having a kind of national collective that's based more on ethnicity than citizenship. Because one of the things the right-wing strongman does is proclaim that bonds of blood, like Steve King, and bonds of ethnicity should trump, so to speak, should weigh more than legal citizenship. And this is also on that basis how they can move to strip people of citizenship. This is going this way in North America. It's like step by step by step. So Mussolini was he's the first to do this. He was very effective. He banned the term emigrant, and he relabeled immigrants Italians abroad. He even created a ministry of Italians abroad. And he did an outreach for all the little Italies of the world, including the ones in Canada, and making them ambassadors to the nation, giving cruises to their children, all kinds of welfare benefits. And today we see in a lesser scale, Duterte doing this with Philippines, Modi doing this with Indian expatriates, and Erdogan, who's called for Turks resident abroad to be ambassadors of the nation. Now, they also tell different kinds of stories. While liberal democratic leaders tend to talk about progress and look to the future, you know you're in strongman territory when someone starts talking about doom and gloom, narratives of decline and decay. In the interwar period, these leaders frightened people with tales of the decline of white civilization. Mussolini wrote an article in 1934 called, "Is the White Race Dying?" And in fact, way before Hitler, he had a whole racial, I call it white racial rescue in my book. He had the whole blueprint for it way before Hitler came to power. And today we have Putin and Orban having similar scare tactics about, and this is why demographics are so important to this crew. I almost fell out of my chair when I was watching Trump's nomination speech, accepting the Republican nomination. I was going to write a piece on CNN, so I was watching it. And I heard him talk about death and dying and tombstones and graves. He actually compared America to a friend dying of cancer and soon to be cremated. If things didn't change, presumably by electing him, he was simply accepting the nomination. It's supposed to be a happy occasion. He said, soon there will be, quote, absolutely nothing left. So I thought, oh my God, I've seen this before. And this is what he's doing. Now, of course, this negative politics is very, very emotionally effective, and it allows the strongman to proclaim the death of everything and have himself step in as the savior. So it's a cycle of things, but I alone can fix it, said Trump, said Mussolini, said Hitler, say all of them. So it's a narrative, mechanism that they spin, and it works like a charm. So being a savior is part of the strongman's charisma, and that's the X factor, of course, in explaining his appeal. Now, we often describe the charisma as, famously undefinable, the je ne sais quoi, right? It's an invisible but powerful force that some people have that makes them stand out from a crowd. And it's played a large role in positioning the strongman as an exceptional individual, including by those who don't agree with his politics. Leaders of democracies have certainly had the it factor, right? John F. Kennedy and Nelson Mandela, they had adulation just by their presence. But the strongman's charisma is a different kind of charisma than the movie star or the fantastic democratic politician. It's said to have the effect of not only drawing people toward you, which is traditional charisma, but putting the viewer or the person in his presence under a spell to make them do his bidding. So charisma's hold has been used time and again as an explanation for why people fall for the strongman, let him get away with violence and corruption, and follow him to the point of collective ruin. So you hear things that he was a spellbinder, he put us in a trance. It was like we were mesmerized, said the Germans and the Italians and others. Hitler, or plug in the name, made us do it, right? So it's been disturbing to see the media presenting today's authoritarian charmers in the same manner, regardless of how many people they persecute. Erdogan is said to have, quote, rock star charisma. And Putin, of course, has spawned a whole subculture of fanatical admirers. Half of America wonders how the other half has succumbed to Trump Gnosis, which is a term invented by the hypnotist Richard Barker after he witnessed a campaign rally and he said that Trump was putting people in what he called a hypnotic trance, and he's been a hypnotist for like 40 years, this guy. So once Trump took office, amid the cloud of his odd nonchalance about Russian interference in American elections, the comedian Trevor Noah joked that it was Trump who'd been hypnotized by Putin. So I talk a lot about bodies in the book, the bodies of people who are persecuted, the bodies of the leader, and the leader's physical presence, as you see from this, and representations of his body are crucial to the exercise of power. And that's why they have their cults of personality and their propaganda machines that work overtime to make them seem omnipresent. And you think of, I'm going to use in the book, I use the Hitler salute, right? Because in having to invoke Hitler in every normal social transaction, you conjured his presence, right? So there are many ways about the absence and the presence of the body of the leader, but all has to rotate around him. Even after death, they remain larger than life. On internet nostalgia sites that show them always in their costume splendor, rather than as they ended up, exiled or murdered by those they victimized. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow, the visual identity of fascism and how it's remembered. It's a lot more pleasant to see them, just if you're not coming tomorrow, simply Google Italian fascism, German Nazism. You will see the leader in the crowd, and you will see them intact, not a pile of ashes, which is how Hitler's ended up, or with their faces bashed in and hanging upside down like Mussolini. You will not see that. You will see them as they would have wanted you to remember them. So the strongman is a man above all else. He's a man above all other men. He's the father protector of the nation, and in some countries, a semi-deity. His manhood factors heavily into the perception of him as a charismatic individual who can take the risks and do the work to make his people safe and respected. And I have a nice collection of Trump homage to Trump by his followers. And this is one that, of course, this is supposed to be John Wayne in True Grit. And this is the Western. There's a whole lot of these, and this is like the Western genre. And Trump, indeed, when he says, I can stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I won't lose any followers, Fifth Avenue being his turf, and the Trump Tower his fort. So there's a lot of Western things. And then here's somebody who sees, I have a lot of these, and if you come across any, please send me more. So here he's like a Tarzan, strongman. It's very interesting. He's like rescuing liberty, but he's actually kidnapping. It's like, and who knows what will happen to Lady Liberty, thrown over his shoulder. So that's, I'm not sure this gentleman intended that interpretation, but. So he's also a sex symbol, the strongman, and an emblem of virility as it's understood in his particular time and place. So I write about, the kind of display of the male body, and there are some who are exhibitionists, and then there's some who are kind of statuesque, like a Pinochet, where they're uniformed, and there's different genres. And also, their virility manifested in their control of female bodies. So here's Qaddafi and his entourage of bodyguards, or he was known also for his beautiful nurses. And Trump, of course, boasting that he can grab women and treat them like objects. So this performance of virility is very important. And gender is an excellent lens into the paradoxes of their rule. For example, most of them are highly misogynistic. Qaddafi's Green Book compares women to poultry. And Berlusconi, of course, loved to insult women and boast about his sex parties. Yet many women love them as protectors, avengers of national pride, and leaders who promote women and give them a sense of value within the national community, even as they take their rights away. And of course, Hitler did this, Mussolini, but Putin's been very effective. He promotes a lot of women to high-ish office, and yet he decriminalized domestic violence. So it's important to talk about the strongman's weaknesses, since he mobilizes threat and persuasion and has the personality cult to make himself seem invincible. So I emphasize how dependent he is on others. Charisma, since Max Weber onward, the theorist, is in the eye of the beholder. So the strongman is very dependent on your approval. And one of the reasons he is so obsessed with having rallies and direct contact situations, also obsessed with optics, crowd size, right? When we see those, when you Google, which I advise you to do, maybe you don't have to, you Google Nazi Germany or Hitler, and you see him commanding the crowd, what you're not seeing is that some people were there because they loved him and they wanted to be there. A whole lot of people were there because they got a postcard, which also happens in all dictatorships, saying if you didn't appear, there would be consequences. So we don't see that. All we see is his command of bodies, right? So Trump gets very exercised about the optics of his crowd size. And this tells you something about insecurity. You adulate me, therefore I am, is the strongman's maxim. And the other thing is that we think of them as kind of naturally charismatic. In fact, they work very hard at their persona. So Mussolini used to send out fan cards. He was very, very attentive. He was a journalist by training, to his fan base. So it's signed with a signature like a Hollywood fan cloud. And in fact, this genre of ruler came about at the same time as the Hollywood star machine in the interwar period. So here he's sending a summer postcard, and he's on vacation. And it's very interesting because he's letting himself be looked at, but he's got a handheld movie camera. So he's telling you, you can look at me, but I control the gaze, right? That's typical him. And Hitler, in 1925, he did this repeatedly, before he came to power, when he was working on his persona, he hired a photographer to document him practicing his gestures in the mirror. So again, these people work at their persona. They are not naturally, they don't arrive and just enchant. There's a lot of work behind it. So Berlusconi is an important transition figure in this regard. He was already a billionaire, and it's important, of a media and public relations conglomerate when he became prime minister. He was so telegenic and skilled at branding himself that a woman who Italian psychologists interviewed in the early 2000s for a study on dementia could no longer identify her own family. She could identify three faces: the Pope, Jesus Christ, and Berlusconi. And in fact, as you see, A New Miracle, he often said that he was the Jesus Christ of Italian politics. So we're back to the savior again. All right, so what does it take to get rid of the strongman? Every fall is different, but some common dynamics stand out. Economic downturn. It has to be a bad economic downturn, like the Eurozone crisis got rid of Berlusconi in 2011. And this is because it affects the bank accounts of his elites, right? That's when they feel the pain is when they're going to desert him. Or involvement in a ruinous war. Internal resistance can build until democratization is impossible to avoid, and this happened, of course, in the Eastern Bloc with communism, but it took a very long time. Or liberation struggles in contiguous countries can migrate, and this happened to Qaddafi with the Arab Spring. I also evaluate techniques of resistance, strategies of resistance that have proven effective against a century of strongmen, as well as newer ones made possible by social media, which is a double-edged sword for sure. And our notions of resistance sometimes still draw, rightfully so, on armed resistance against the fascists in World War II. But studies show how important nonviolent resistance is, and unarmed, against a regime as a means of combating strongmen. Protests are vital. They reclaim public space colonized by the regime. They let the rulers see that the people are not cowed. And they let, and this is important, they let elites know, elites are seeing those mass protests, know that there is space for maneuver. And so sometimes political science studies show that when things are at a certain point, you can sway elites to defect from the leader if they think there's enough, because what are politicians always doing? They're thinking of their own, their own futures, right? So protests are important, but smaller gestures have great value, and it's only by living in a dictatorship that you can appreciate what it means to leave a leaflet or risk your life to write some graffiti, right? Or even wear colors that suggest a liberation movement that's been banned. Or refusing to send your child to a political assembly, or frequent the shop of a suspected informer, right? All of these things are ways that people have struck back. We are here, these gestures say. There are others who feel the same way as you. You are not alone. And it's very important, because what rulers like this want to do is desensitize you, exhaust you, make you feel extremely alone, like you're the only one who's protesting. So I don't know if you've ever seen this work of Robin Bell. He's a public artist, and he projects things on the facade of Trump Tower International, Trump Hotel in D.C. He also does things on the nearby government buildings, but this is his favorite place. He combines, it's very important, his work. I interviewed him. And he kind of tries to take back public space from its colonization by Trump. All the things I just said, he lets people know that there is protest around. And in fact, when I asked him, well, what does Trump think of this? He said, I couldn't care less what Trump thinks. This is not for Trump. This is for people to see that I'm doing it, which is a significant, because you might think that because he's always, what he does is that the Trump thugs run out, and the police sometimes protect him from the Trump thugs. But it doesn't last very long. They're ephemeral things. But then, of course, in our media culture, they're on YouTube in 2 seconds. The most famous one he had was when Trump said that African countries were the cesspool of humanity. He had, this is a S-hole, and he had poop emojis. He's very inventive. They were flowing like up to, you have to look at it. It is very funny. Okay. To conclude. So, one thing is true. For every strongman who dies in office, there are 2 who exit involuntarily. Of the deceased rulers I discuss, only Pinochet and Franco died natural deaths in office. The others were executed, or Hitler killed himself, or they went into exile. That strongmen have never been deterred by this history of bad endings is a measure of their grandiosity. They always think they're going to be the exception to the rule. So this is to say that they're often their own worst enemies. Most of them are only intermittently competent, and they spend a lot of time and resources to cover up their incompetence. They control the media, and so when they squash critics and they control, propaganda, it's also to preserve the illusion of competency. When they surround themselves by family and flatterers because they can't stand any critics, they are doing themselves a disservice because they leave themselves in a vacuum where they're not getting any good information, and they tend to make bad judgments. And this has happened in the past, and this is one way that Mussolini entering World War II, this has led to their downfall. So when Trump comes along today and says, on this subject, someone asked him, who do you consult with on foreign policy? He said, quote, I'm speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain, and I've said a lot of things. So I'm going to repeat that. Yes, I know, it must sink in. I'm speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain, and I've said a lot of things. So he has his own archive. No, it's a perfect hermetically sealed Trump, I don't know what the word would be. He's his own archive. He's his own consultant. He is everything for himself. And he would like to be everything for you as well. Luckily not you, but you've escaped him. So many people just shake their heads, or they say he's crazy, or they just say he's got a giant ego. I see a century's worth of strongmen gazing at themselves in the mirror with their hands clamped over their ears so they can block out anything that contradicts their version of reality. When the strongman is ripe for an overthrow, he's often the last to know. So the history of strongmen teaches us that authoritarianism is not something that's presented to us fait accompli, other than in circumstances of military coup. It's something that we help along step by step when we acquiesce to slow changes in the political climate that slowly move the boundaries of what is possible and acceptable to say and do. So Trump is merely the latest example. And here, this was how he appeared on stage to accept the nomination. And he was like a rock star with the fog, like at a concert. And I saw this and I thought, oh, well, gee, he's telling us he's not really going to be very transparent, for one, that he will remain a cipher, that he will try and drain our swamps, but he will never reveal his own. So if we're not careful, that fog will come to cloud our own minds, letting us follow the easy path of quietness and passivity. The strongman says that consent is for the weak in politics and sex. The burden is on us, if we live in a democracy, to let him know through our voices and our votes that we don't agree. Thank you.